right, thanks for having me. I'm contractually obligated to show this Auburn, War Eagle. So you can do all the Q code there and all that other stuff. And then I'm going to do one shameless plug and maybe another one at the end. So everything I'm going to say, you can find in my book, Rivers of Sand, on your left. Okay? So and there's much more detail in that. But if you're interested and you want more information, buy that. On the right is a book that are the primary sources that I use to write Rivers of Sand. Every military officer had to keep a journal or write letters of their travels west, and every single one of them is in Bending Their Way Onward. And those are all from the National Archives, transcribed, edited, annotated, etc. And they're both for sale in the back table in the foyer there. All right? Okay, so, and I'll also mention too that Rivers of Sand was my Auburn dissertation for my graduate degree. And when I approached that topic back 20 years ago, I really wanted to know how was the government able to remove 23,000 people who did not want to leave, who did not want to move to present-day Oklahoma, all right? And what I found was, and this is not unique to the Creeks, but it was through treaties. All right, when I was growing up, I just kind of assumed Andrew Jackson became president, sent in the army, rounded up everybody, and pushed them west. And that's not what happened at all. In fact, removal predates Andrew Jackson, all right? So what the federal government did after the War of 1812 is to send commissioners down to Indian nations to try to get the Indians to cede land, all right? And Indians did not want to cede land at all, and so they tried to find a somewhat high-ranking chief or headman who would be willing to take a bribe, okay? And the person for the Creeks who took the bribe is William McIntosh here, okay? And as you can tell, he's got a Scottish ancestry on his father's side. He was bilingual, so he spoke the Muskogean language. He also spoke English, and he was the fifth-ranking member of the Creek National Council, okay? And in 1824, commissioners came down to negotiate with William McIntosh. He had ceded land on two different occasions in the 18-teens and then in 1821. And after those sessions, the Creek National Council passed a law punishing any person to sign a land cession treaty without the approval of the National Council with death. And so in 1824, when commissioners came down to try to get him to cede land again, he was very cognizant of the fact that his life was in danger. They actually negotiated this treaty in the middle of the night in the woods in Georgia, okay, to hide what he was doing from the other chiefs. In February of 1825, the treaty was presented, and it ceded. This is a map of from 1823, but this is largely what you're going to see in 25. It ceded all the Creek land in Georgia and the northern part of the Creek land in Alabama to the federal government in exchange for equal parts land in present-day Oklahoma. All right, this is the Treaty of Indian Springs. Okay. And the treaty was an immigration treaty as well. And so it would pay for the transportation of any Creek Indian who wanted to move west. And it would pay for a year's worth of crops, of food, I should say, until they can get their land cleared in the west and their crops harvested. Okay? When this treaty was presented, chaos broke out because 49/50ths of the Creek people did not approve of this treaty. It was not sanctioned by the Creek National Council. And as a result, they went about trying to get this treaty overturned. And so they sent a delegation up to Washington to try to get the new administration of John Quincy Adams to overturn it. And then they deliberated on what to do with William McIntosh. And on the last day of April in 1825, they executed McIntosh. And it was something like out of a Hollywood movie, right? They show up in the middle of the night at his plantation, 150 or so warriors. There's a gunfight. He stumbles out onto his front piazza, just like in a Wild West show, and he's shot dead. And then they drag his corpse to the edge of his property, and they shoot 100 or so balls into his dead body. It's a rage killing. That's how angry they are that he ceded their land, okay? But it was not a rash execution, right? They deliberated for a few months before they actually carried it out. the Creek delegation to Washington is effective ultimately. There's also commissioners that come down to Alabama to deal with the Creeks to try to get them initially to abide by the treaty. And then very quickly they realize this treaty is fraudulent. And so just to fast forward really quick, in January of 1826, so almost a year later, the Treaty of Indian Springs is nullified. It's the only Indian treaty in American history that is overturned after it has been confirmed by the Senate and ratified by the President of the United States. All right? So they did a really, really good job. Now the problem is that the Treaty of Washington doesn't give back their Georgia land. So what happens is Georgia is, for that year that the Creeks are trying to get the Treaty of Indian Springs overturned, Georgia is threatening, their governor, George Troup, is threatening civil war if 1 square foot of land is returned. And so the Treaty of Washington will give their Alabama land back to the Creek Nation, but not their Georgia land. The Treaty of Washington will also continue this immigration policy. So it will just like the Treaty of Indian Springs, will pay for travel, and it will pay for the first year worth of food. Okay, I lumped the Treaty of Indian Springs and the Treaty of Washington together as more or less the same treaty. The only difference is one gives back the Alabama land, one takes it. But they're essentially the same type of treaty. All right? And this treaty is not unique to the Creek people. All right? These types of treaties were used all throughout the South and in the Old Northwest to try to get the Indians to move west. All right? Okay, so about 2 years after the Treaty of Indian Springs, almost 3 years after the Treaty of Indian Springs, the first McIntosh party leaves. And I call it the McIntosh party because everybody that left the Creek Nation in 1827, November of 1827, were friends, followers, or business partners of the late William McIntosh. There are 2 McIntosh parties. The first one leaves in November of 1827. The other one leaves in October or so of 1828. And the route, so this is the second McIntosh party. And the way these immigrations work is that there's sub-camps. Army officers come down to try to figure out where the likelihood of the Creeks are, the Creeks that are most likely to emigrate are, and then they establish a camp. And these camps are usually just a tent, 1 wagon, and an agent just sitting there, a sub-agent. And then you come in, put your stuff there. They'll tell you to come back in a few weeks when the immigration starts to march west. Here you have Fort Bainbridge as a sub-site, a sub-camp site. And then they move to what is called the rendezvous point. And that's when all these sub-camps will coalesce at a rendezvous point. The first McIntosh party, their rendezvous point is at Harpersville, which is just to the southeast of Birmingham. This one is at Fort Strother, which is an old First Creek War site. And from there, they're going to kind of go up. So the first McIntosh party, so Harpersville's kind of here. They march up to Tuscumbia, and then it's at that point where they realize that they need to take boats. The Creek people did not want to be cooped up on a boat. They thought it was unhealthy to be kind of below deck and breathing each other's air. And the government didn't want to use boats, primarily because it costs more money. It's just cheaper to move them west by land. And so here it rains every single day on the first McIntosh party. It's mud, they're wading through water, and it's clear that women and children and elderly men need to take boats. And so it's at Tuscumbia that they take boats, the Tuscumbia landing, and then they'll go down here, down the Tennessee River. They'll hit the Ohio briefly, and then down the Mississippi to Memphis. The men typically don't want to leave their horses, and they don't want to leave their possessions. They don't trust the government to take care of it. So they're going to march with these wagons, regardless of the conditions. And they'll march on the south here, a little bit through Mississippi and Tennessee, and they'll go to Memphis. This first McIntosh party, the women and children, the boats leave, they go very quickly. The rivers are high, they move quickly. The men are bogged down every step of the way. This area to the west of Memphis is just one swamp after another. These rivers, the White River, the Cache River, the St. Francis, they're just overflowed on the banks. And so the men are literally swimming across the road during this time because it's like waist deep water. Meanwhile, the women, they continue down the Mississippi. They'll go, there's a little cutoff here that gets them to the Arkansas River, And they go the whole way, and they're there fairly quickly. The men just swimming this entire way. And they make it, and then the terminus of this is Fort Gibson. All right, Cantonment Gibson until 1832 when it becomes an official fort in what is now Oklahoma. This map is from the second McIntosh party, and the weather is the opposite. It is bone dry. And so the experiences of the water party and the land party are the opposite as well. So the men, 54 days from leaving Fort Strother until they hit Fort Gibson. The women and children and elderly men are constantly delayed because these rivers, real low, they're hitting sandbars all the way. Okay? First two McIntosh parties this one ends up in January 1829. The third voluntary party leaves in June, July of 1829. 1,300 people in this third voluntary party. That is more than the first two combined. So about 700 leave in 1827, about 600 leave in 1828. Now you have a party of 1,300. And here's the deal. None of them have any real connection to William McIntosh. Yeah. Or at least very few of them do. This is the Creek's worst nightmare, the headman's worst nightmare. And this is exactly what the Treaty of Indian Springs was designed to do, the Treaty of Washington and Treaty of Indian Springs. The Treaty of Indian Springs was designed to take a large population of people, cram them onto a small slip of land, eliminate their hunting ground, and then watch starvation begin to set in. And then also, if you look at a map, if we go back to this map here, you have this buffer. So most Creeks lived right here on the Chattahoochee. Some lived on the Flint, and then over here in Montgomery where the Upper Creeks lived. A lot of this area right here is just hunting ground. And so these little tiny dinky towns like Forsyth and whatever, if you want to get to the heart of the Lower Creeks, you're going to be traveling over 50, 60, 70 miles of road. Really bad road. Dangerous road, believe it or not. And so this hunting land created a buffer between whites and the Creek Indians. But when Georgia loses or the Creeks lose their Georgia land, what happens? Within a year or two, Columbus, Georgia is platted right on the Chattahoochee River. And Columbus becomes a boom town and a jumping off point into the Creek Nation. So instead of traveling a couple days over really, really bad roads and dangerous roads, now you just cross a bridge and you're in the heart of 7,000 to 8,000 people. And what whites would do is sell them alcohol on credit, merchandise on credit. The idea is to get them indebted to you. A lot of them just went in and stole their land, stole their cabins, kicked them out of their fields. And so you see a lot of problems with starvation, white encroachment, alcohol abuse beginning to creep up because of these treaties. The government knows that they're not going to be able to live in a small strip of land without their former hunting ground. And by 1829, you really see this beginning to happen because you see 1,300 Creek Indians who don't want to go. We have a letter that basically says we're only going because our children love to hunt and there's no hunting in the east. We're going west for our children's future. That's exactly what the Treaty of Indian Springs and Treaty of Washington were designed to do. All right? And so the Creek headmen who are opposed to removal, they really quickly understand that the thing that's going to force them west is a slow disintegration of their people moving. 500 move here, 1,000 move there, 2,000 move here. The Creeks have strength in numbers. But if every year a few, several hundred leave, then that strength in numbers is going to be weakened. And so they're doing everything they possibly can to prevent people from leaving. They let the McIntosh party go. They had no problem with them. They consider them traitors. So the first two emigrating parties that leave, more or less not a big deal. But you do begin to see there's some Uchis that are encamped, and headmen come in and disperse them, tell them they can't emigrate. By 1829, you're seeing them come in and raid these sub-camps because they don't want them to leave. A handful we have on record are actually murdered because they signed up to emigrate. They do pass a law of the Creeks that you can punishable by death for enrolling your name to move west. So things are getting really, really bad in the Creek Nation within a few years of the Treaty of Indian Springs and Treaty of Washington. Now, Jackson takes office in 29. There's delegations of Creek headmen that go to Washington repeatedly, 1830, 31, 32, to try to get either Congress or the president to do something to ameliorate their problems. They have white encroachment. I think if you looked at a list of who antagonized the Creek people the most, white squatters, bar none. I think white squatters had more to do with removing the Indians than Andrew Jackson did in a lot of cases, because they drove the Creek people insane, just illegally squatting on land, evicting families at the end of a gun from their homes, and the Creeks wanted them gone. They did a census in 1830 trying to figure out how many whites are actually in the Creek Nation. So by 1830, there's probably about 21,500 or so Creeks left in the Creek Nation. They found 25,000 white settlers illegally in the Creek Nation. So there was more illegal whites living in the Creek Nation in 1830 than there were Creek Indians themselves. And so that's the reason you get these delegations constantly going to Washington, D.C. What's the president doing? He gets so fed up, Jackson refuses to meet with them. They're in the Indian Queen Hotel in downtown Washington, D.C., just racking up a bill day after day after day after day because nobody from Congress or the president will meet. And so 1832, the Creeks are at a breaking point. They get so desperate that they sign another treaty, and this is the Treaty of Washington. And this is one of the most devastating treaties. And this is not a unique treaty to the Creek people. Lots of other Indians, in fact, the Treaty of Washington was actually modeled after the 1830 Choctaw Treaty of Dancing Rabbit Creek. It was literally modeled after that. But I do know that treaties like this were employed up in the Old Northwest as well, in the modern day Midwest. What this treaty did is it ceded all the rest of the Creek's Alabama land to the federal government in exchange for each family getting 320-acre plot of land. And 320 acres is a mile by a half-mile rectangle. Chiefs, the 90 principal headmen, got a 640-acre plot of land, or a mile by a mile. So then they went out. So this is a map I have in Rivers of Sand, and you can see this. So this is Chambers County, and then you can see where in Alabama this is. This is Chambers, and then that's Tallapoosa County. So you can see, like, for instance, I'm having trouble. So that's like a D1 and an F1 right here. So next page, you'll see a key. F is corresponding to a Lower Creek Indian town. Off the top of my head, I don't know what it is. I'd have to look at the book. But you can see that. So this right here are two Creek families. So each of these squares is a mile by a mile, or 640 acres. When they're cut in half, that's 320 acres. So this would be a Creek family on a 320-acre plot from one town, and a Creek family from another plot from a different town, sharing the same 640 acres right there. If they're large numbers, then what they are is two Creek families from the same town. I just did that so it's easier to read, basically. But you can see, this is Chambers County right here. Notice how many white or otherwise empty squares there are. What happens to that? So let me just give you an example. So there's about 5 million acres of land in the Creek Nation in Alabama in 1832. Okay? If you add up all the 600, there's about 6,500 Creek families that got a 320-acre plot of land. That comes out to about 2.1 million acres. So over half of the Creek Nation that gets seeded will not have a Creek family assigned to it. Well over half. And so what happens to this? It goes up for white auction. And so in the 1830s, though at places like Montgomery or wherever, you can come in and bid on this land. And these are all numbered into township ranges and sections. So it's these maps, if you see them, I only listed the Tallapoosa right here, but these maps are extremely detailed. You can see every little creek running through it, every little road running through it. You can go and see these big maps. I have them in my office. You can see a plot of land with a nice creek running through it, and you can go bid on that particular land. It's real easy to find. And so all of this right here will open up for white ownership. And then I have another map here of, again, this is Russell and Macon counties. So look at all that land. And this is just Lower Creeks, but look at all that land. This is all one, I mean, this is, 36 square miles right there of empty land. Goes up for white settlement. So think about the devastation of this. The Creeks complained about white encroachment, but this treaty legalizes white encroachment, right? The Creeks had passed a law preventing anybody from ceding their land without the approval of the National Council. This treaty dissolves the Creek government. You get a title to your land if you live on it for 5 years, and then you can sell it for money without any repercussions from the Creek National Council, which, by the way, has been dissolved. This is now coming under federal and then ultimately Alabama control. That's why, they already made them into counties, Macon and Russell County. Okay? So all the things that made the Creeks powerful, you can't cede land, otherwise you end up like McIntosh. We don't want white people in our sovereign territory. Well, it's no longer sovereign territory anymore. It's the worst treaty you could ever sign. So why did they do it? I don't really know the answer to that, but I have a hunch. And my hunch is this. Creek Indians wanted a title. They wanted a piece of paper with a signature on it, right? I mean, think about this. Indians were there long before Europeans were. Whites had streamed onto their land illegally for eons. The Creeks forever had told the whites, get off our land, this is ours, we were here first, and whites didn't pay attention to that. But whites really pay attention to a contract, right? A deed, a title, something with a signature on it. Whoa, okay, that is your land. So I think the Creeks were obsessed with that paper. They don't believe us that we were here, or they don't care that we were here first, but they seem to care about somebody holding a piece of paper claiming ownership. We want that piece of paper, right? It came at an enormous cost because we talked about starvation, right? The Treaty of Indian Springs in Washington eliminated the Georgia hunting ground. So you have 7,000 or so Lower Creeks who are now forced into Alabama. They couldn't find any arable soil in a lot of cases. They're landless. They don't have crops. Hunger sets in. We do know that starvation does set in. There are Creek Indians who die of starvation. So now you have the opportunity to get a piece of land and sell it for $400 or $500 and use that money for food. A lot of them sell their land for food. They're desperate. They're desperate for food. They're hungry. And then you have land frauds. And there are massive amounts of land frauds. White speculators come in and use every type of trick in the book to cheat the Indians out of their soil. I'll give you the two most common: impersonation. You find a starving Creek Indian who will be bribed with food, give them food, say, hey, and there's always a federal government sub-agent there that will make sure there's no fraud. Is this your land? Yeah. Are you selling it for $500? Yeah. And then the transaction happens. He notes it in the logbook. He walks away, and the Indian gives back $500, or maybe $495, and he gets a $5 bribe. So he got a $500 piece of land for $5, maybe $10. The other type of fraud, most common type of fraud, is just what they call, quote, taking the money back. So the rightful owner of a piece of land, maybe starving, needs money for food, is willing to sell land to this guy, acknowledges it to the certifying agent, walks away, and then as minute the guy walks away, puts a gun to his head and give it back to me. And in this case, sometimes you don't even get a $5 bribe. You'll get they'll talk about how he just gets some worthless cloth for his troubles, right? So just unimaginable types of fraud that you see. They said the different types of fraud depend on the ingenuity of mankind. I mean, literally, that's what one agent investigating it says. Like, you can't even count all the different types of fraud. One of the most heartbreaking is that there's, so I mentioned all these, you see these black numbers right here, the white numbers in the black boxes. Those are chiefs. So again, 90 principal headmen got a full 640 1 square mile, 640 acre section. And I've mapped where all these Lower Creek chiefs are. their land plot. Well, one was a Tuckabatchee headman. Tuckabatchee's an Upper Creek town, so it's not represented on this map. And he sold his land for $1,000, which is a pretty good price for a piece of land. And afterward, the white guy who participated in the transaction wanted to give him a hug. He thought that was weird, but he hugged him. And while he hugged him, the white guy pulled the $1,000 out of the headman's pouch. He pickpocketed the guy, right? So and if you go to the National Archives, and I've gone through most of them, they're just boxes, like linear feet of boxes of depositions and affidavits of Creek Indians complaining or white people trying to defend themselves against allegations of fraud. So this treaty is a really, really devastating treaty, okay? Now, there are no voluntary emigrating parties between 1829 and 1834. And the reason for that is that, let's go back to the 1829 voluntary emigrating party that leaves in July. 1,300 people go. To the Creek headman's perspective, that's disaster, right? 1,300 people are willing to turn their backs on us and go west. But from Jackson's point of view, it's only 1,300. I want 4,000 to go this year. I want 10,000 to go this year. He wanted to have it really quickly. And so he constantly complained that not enough Creek Indians were signing up to immigrate. So in 1830, he cut off all federally funded immigrations. Creeks could move west, but it would be under their own dime. And what Jackson's trying to do here is he's trying, again, we talked about it, right? These small strip of land, hunting is now basically gone. There's not enough cropland to support 23,000 people. Whites are streaming in from Columbus. All sorts of disasters are happening. Jackson knows they're not going to be able to live like this for very long. They don't want to go now, but they'll go in a couple years. And Jackson said, I'm not going to have anybody sign up for immigration. I'm not going to pay for immigration unless the entire nation goes. Well, 30, 31, 32, nobody's leaving. When this treaty is signed and there's so much land being transferred to white ownership, Jackson now says, okay, maybe we'll open up voluntary immigration again. Okay? This treaty was signed in March of 32, but it's not until late 33 or early 34 that all the land is finally assigned. And then the land frauds begin really in earnest in 1834. So in 1834, voluntary immigration starts up again. And they have camps established at various places like Fort Hull and Fort Mitchell. And then the rendezvous point here is Centerville. Okay? This emigrating party was supposed to leave in the summertime. But Jackson told the agents in charge of it not to leave until they have a minimum of 2,000 people enrolled. Well, to show you how much the Creeks love their land, they would rather starve on their land and die than move to Indian territory. So there's only about 300, 400, 500, 600 that actually sign up. And so this immigration gets delayed because they don't have the minimum 2,000. July turns into August. August turns into September, October, November. They don't leave until December of 1834. Meanwhile, all their winter clothes have been packed in wagons because it's July when they finally signed up to leave. And they don't have access to their winter clothing. And so they're basically going in their summer clothing, which is very minimal. It rains, hails, or snows every single day they're there. They are caught in a brutal, brutal storm. So they leave Centerville, they go through Tuscaloosa, they cross into Mississippi and go bisect the corner of Mississippi here. And notice they're going all by land because the Indians don't like traveling by boat, but also the government wants to save as much money as possible. The trip from Tuscaloosa to Memphis is just miserable. The agent talks about having to stop every 5 miles to warm the women and children, who, by the way, are in the wagons crying because of the hypothermia setting in. They have to light fires. They wrap them in tents. They do whatever. He's talking about all the misery that these people are experiencing because their winter clothes are packed away. Finally, they get to Memphis. They realize they have to get on a boat. So they charter a steamboat. They go down the Mississippi River. They go up the Arkansas. The Arkansas is a really finicky river. It can flood like crazy, or it can be just bone dry. And in this case, in December of 1834, January of 1835, it's frozen solid. They actually at one point ram the steamboat into the ice, trying to break it up. At one point, they get out of the steamboat, go on the bank, and cut the trees so that the impact will break up the ice. It does, I guess, because they get from Pine Bluff to Little Rock, barely. And then at Little Rock, they realize they can't go any further, so they have to walk the rest of the way. Meanwhile, of course, the men want to go by land. This whole area that we talked about being inundated with water most of the year, or at least in the rainy season, completely frozen over. So imagine and they only went by land because they wanted to accompany their horses. They actually had to tie rope around the horses' hooves. Can you imagine a horse on ice? It's not going to be very graceful. So they tied rope around the legs of the horses and dragged them across the ice. So at Little Rock, they end up, the women and children and elderly men have to walk the rest of the way because the Arkansas is completely frozen over. Meanwhile, there's an influenza epidemic going on, and they can't stop and warm and make camp and warm them up with fire because they're afraid that if they stay in one place too long, they're going to get sick. And so they make it to Fort Gibson going as fast as they can over frozen ground. I forget off the top of my head, only when I say only, it's just funny how, when you think of time now, if 8 or 9 people died today on an expedition like this, there'd be congressional hearings and firings and jail time. But back then, the agents are patting themselves on the back. Hey, only 9 or 11 or 12 people died. That's great, right? So it's just a different time in history that, that's not such a bad thing. Okay, so only 600 people ended up leaving. They never got to the 2,000. A year later, another emigrating party is organized, and they say that they're going to try to avoid the mistakes they made on the first one, but yet they fall into the same trap. They don't leave in the summer like they should have. They leave in November, December again, only this time in 1835. So here you see sub-camps. There's a Joseph Marshall is a fairly prominent, not a headman of any sort, but he's bilingual. So he makes a lot of the documentation. He's got a reserve here. There's another encampment just to the north of his. They meet at Young's Ferry, and then they go to Wetumpka. And whites by this time have gotten pretty smart. If there's several hundred Creek Indians congregated waiting to put their names in, whites are going to be there to sell them alcohol, right? And so that's what they find when they get there. There's only 500 people in this emigration, but they get to Wetumpka, and there's white people, selling them alcohol like crazy. It's so bad, they actually cross the river and go into Autauga County briefly. They're kind of running away from them. Well, anyway, they go up. You can see the route up here. And it's the same thing. So so if you're wondering why I mentioned like Montevallo, I didn't mention it on other ones where they definitely go through Montevallo, but on a map, if you ever read Rivers of Sand, I only point to wherever it mentions a town, I will plot it. So, for example, if you're wondering, like they'll do this in 1836, they'll make this trip here through Montevallo as well. If I don't mention it, it's because it's not in the documentation. So what happens is one of the guys in the letter saying we're passing through Montevallo, and so I plotted it. Nothing happens in Montevallo per se, but I'm just noting that it makes the documentation. So they go through Cortland, and then it's here at Waterloo that they basically charter a steamboat, and they're being towed by some barges. So there's these flat boats that the Creeks are riding on, and then there's some Creeks in the steamboat Alpha as well. So they leave Waterloo, and they do the same thing. Of course, they go up here. Nothing that I know of happens in Paducah, but they mention it. And then again, the men go through here. It's wintertime. It's muddy. There's not the same level of problems that they have in the immigration the year before, but it is muddy. They talk about how deep and muddy it is on the roads. The only really thing that happens of note on this immigration is that the keelboat will hit a snag on the Arkansas River right here, right around where Lewisburg is. And a snag, if you don't know, is basically just a tree that's fallen into the river, and just bobs there for a while until one end gets waterlogged, and then it'll kind of go, and if the current hits it, it'll just dig into the current. Meanwhile, the top of it's just bobbing just below the surface. You can't see it. And it'll rip the bottom out of a steamboat. Snags are terrifying because you just all of a sudden don't see anything. Next thing you know, and you're just ripping the bottom out and your boat goes down in a few minutes. And it's really, really problematic. And so in this case, it's the flatboat that the steamboat is towing that has the creeks on it that hits the snag. And I only mention this because we have two different documented cases of this. So you have the agents who are conducting the creeks west who note that they hit a snag, and that's all they really say about it. Hit a snag, no big deal. But the guy who owns the steamboat Alpha was on that boat, and he noticed that when it hit a snag, it threw the Indians into the water, and they were screaming and yelling, and it was a big to-do, right? So you have kind of two different records of this. Government agents, not such a big deal. And this guy is going, wow, they got thrown into the water, and it was a big deal. So anyway, so that's that there. So by 1836, the creeks are in a real desperate situation. Okay, all the problems we've talked about with starvation, hunger, white encroachment, alcohol abuse is just getting worse and worse and worse. The government keeps coming in with agents trying to convince the Indians to emigrate, which drives them insane because they've repeatedly said, we don't want to leave. And this is true. Think about this. There's still 20,000 Creek Indians in Alabama. Despite all the problems that we've talked about, they're like, I don't care. I'd rather die on my land than live to be old in a strange country. It tells you all you need to know about how much they love their land. And so in May of 1836, a group of young warriors decide to take matters in their own hands, and they start a war. And this is the Second Creek War. Anywhere from 2,500 to 3,000 Creek Indians participated. It went from May to July 1836. It'll continue on again, but the government thinks it's over by July. The government actually asks Creek chiefs to help them put down the Creek War, which they do. And this gives Andrew Jackson the excuse he needs to remove the Creek Indians from Alabama. Those captured are put in handcuffs, and they're trapped. They're in the stockade at Fort Mitchell, which is where I spoke last week, actually, right on the Georgia border. There's another camp of handcuffed at Tuskegee. And from Fort Mitchell to Montgomery, they march by land in pods of 300 people, handcuffed, shackled around the ankles with a chain running between the guy in front of you and the guy behind you. And the men are completely silent as they march. Because in Creek culture, in Indian culture, men are supposed to be stoic. You don't show pain, don't show joy, you don't show discomfort. You let the women show joy, you let the women show pain and sadness on your behalf. So these men, who you can imagine are just insane with rage and sadness, completely silent. The only thing the agents note is that you'll hear a grunt, because if you're chained to the guy behind you and in front of you, you have to be very coordinated in order to march, because if one person takes too big of a step, he's going to jerk the guy's ankle behind him. Or if you move your hand too much, it's going to jerk the guy's wrist behind you. And you hear the grunts when the handcuffs are tugging at the person in front or behind them. Meanwhile, wagon loads of women just screaming. Okay? Just like Irish keening, right? Just this incredible amount of wailing to show how sad they are about leaving the land of their ancestors. Okay? And of course, whites trying to sell them alcohol along the way, or steal their horses, or steal their enslaved peoples, etc., etc. Okay? They go to Montgomery. They go down the Alabama. They just briefly in Mobile, and then they go New Orleans, up the Mississippi. By the time they get to Natchez, the Creek. Now there is one letter from an army officer who says that there was a plot to escape. And that the plot was hatched in the middle of the night, and it only stopped when everybody on the hurricane deck of the steamboat pointed their guns at the chiefs who they thought were going to escape. But that only makes one letter. So who knows? It didn't make the official journal of the guy conducting this. So I don't know what the deal is with that. Anyway, by the time they get to Natchez, the handcuffs are off. The Creeks look like they're not going to escape. And so when they go to Natchez to get wood for the boilers for the steamboat, they're free to go swim, run around, do whatever they want. And then when the bell is rung, they come back onto the boat. This is July of 1836, so it's the busy season of steamboat usage, and so they borrowed a steamboat, they rented a steamboat that was on its way to St. Louis. And so they could only take them part of the way. So they agreed at Montgomery's Point to go up the White River and stop at Rock Row, which I think is like modern day near Clarendon or whatever, Arkansas, but doesn't exist anymore. This is a major stopping point. It's as high as really you can get on the river. And it's here that they have to scour the countryside for wagons. I mean, think about this. This is not a really well planned out operation, right? Or if it is planned out, things always go sideways and they're always having to kind of figure stuff out. So they probably thought, well, we'll just get a steamboat, take them all the way. But, oh, no, we can only get them to Rock Row. Now what do we do? So they're in camp for weeks while agents go all over the place looking for food, looking for wagons, etc. And the Creeks are just there. And there's little acts of resistance. And this is one of the things I really take great pains to say. That the Creeks at every turn engaged in resistance strategies to try to thwart removal. Every step of the way. In this case, it's a small one. For example, they get to Rock Row. Everything's unloaded from the steamboat. They see the barrels with the handcuffs in it. In the middle of the night, they roll them into the river, never to be found again. They're somewhere in the bottom of the White River, probably under 50 feet of mud, okay? There's also little resistance strategies. So, for example, the most important celebration of the year for the Creek people is the Creek Busk, the green corn dance, celebrating the harvest of the new year, okay? It's always around July. And as the Creek War is raging, as the government is coming in trying to get as many Creek Indians west as they possibly could, there are some people who are in hiding who emerge from hiding specifically to go to a green corn ceremony. They were willing to risk being captured and sent west because that's how important the green corn ceremony was to them. It's like missing Christmas or whatever, Hanukkah, if you celebrate that. But again, when they're marching through Arkansas, the agent or the surgeon, there's a doctor accompanying the delegation, the party. He notices they're stealing anything green, fruit, corn, whatever, from people along the route. He also notices that whenever they stop, they're doing a lot of dancing. And so it's my belief that these Creeks are doing sort of a green corn ceremony, right? Just, they can't do a formal one. They usually last 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 days. A lot of dancing, a lot of stuff. They can't do it. So they're doing whatever they can. It would be inconceivable to them to miss a green corn ceremony, even if they're shackled or even if they're prisoners along the way. Okay? So they leave in July. They get there in August to Fort Gibson. There's another party that leaves, mostly of women and children. That leaves in August, okay? So now here's the thing. Andrew Jackson, after the prisoners leave, about 2,500 leave, Jackson tells the rest of the Creek people, you have to leave as well. Even those who participated in helping the federal government end the Creek War. So I call this ethnic cleansing. If you read the subtitle of my book, I call it ethnic cleansing because that's what it was. The federal government wanted every last Creek Indian gone. There were many Creek people who had white, paternal parentage, who spoke English and Muskogee, they're bilingual, who lived like white Southern planters with enslaved peoples, who were wealthier than any white people in the region, who contributed to the tax base of Alabama. Did not matter. Go. They wanted them all gone. So here you have the rest of the Creek people, even headmen who had helped the federal government stop the Creek War. They have to go now too. There were 5 camps set up through East Alabama. So there's one at Tallahassee, Detachment 1, There's one at Wetumpka, Detachment 2. They're all under a chief called Apathiloholo, who is one of the most prominent headmen in the Creek Nation during the removal era. There's 2 up in Talladega, and then there's one in Chambers County, kind of near Lafayette, or however they pronounce it down here. They each have a prescribed route. They're going to leave in staggered days, usually a week apart, and they're going to have different routes to Memphis because each party has about 2,000 to 3,000 people in it, and they're just going to clean the roadside full of provisions. So if you have 16,000 or 18,000 people going on the same route, you're not going to find enough food. So we need to have them staggered. Detachment 1 leaves on August 31st, 1836, followed by Detachment 2. Now let me talk about these first 2 detachments really quickly because I mentioned resistance, right? We've already talked about resistance. Executing McIntosh was resistance, right? For ceding land. Going to Washington, D.C. and convincing the federal government to overturn the Treaty of Indian Springs is resistance, right? Starting a war is resistance. Rolling the handcuffs into the river is resistance. Every step of the way you see resistance. Here's a big resistance strategy. So I mentioned, you can see the hash marks there. That's the route that Detachment 1 was supposed to take. You can see it going right through here. So, Detachment 2 was going to go up here. Okay? If you notice, oops, they go the same route. Notice the dark line there? They go the same route because Apathiloholo is in charge of the people of Detachment 1 and 2. Those are his people. He tells, as Detachment 1 goes through Wetumpka, he tells the 3,000 Creek Indians there, follow in my footsteps. Okay, so they leave. Detachment 2 leaves from Wetumpka several days later. They go through Centerville. They go to Tuscaloosa, and it's here that the road is going to fork. Apathiloholo is going to go through Cotton Gin Port. The other one's going to go up here, and they're going to. And when they get to Tuscaloosa, and the Creeks of Detachment 2 hear that they're not following in the exact same path as Apathiloholo, they refuse to march. Think about this. When I was in high school, I just assumed Jackson was elected. He sent the army in. He bayoneted every last Indian west. The Indians had no recourse at all. But what it really was U.S. Army officers, like West Point graduates, these are lieutenants and captains in some cases, begging the chiefs to march 5 miles more because there's a spring there. There's no water here, please. And if the Creeks didn't want to march, they're going to plop right down. And forget the wagons with their possessions marching, because the Indians would come in and take their possessions out of the wagons and just put them on the floor. Go ahead. Empty wagons can leave. I don't care. We're just going to camp here. Every step of the way. And you get the sense, because there were some times where they camped where there was no water. I mean, clearly, there's food and there's clean water 5 miles more. Let's just keep going 5 miles more. It's only like 2 o'clock in the afternoon. You get the sense that when they don't want to go, it's not that they wouldn't be more comfortable if they had done 5 more miles. And by the way, the Creeks could cover 30 miles in a day if they want to go hunting. This is not like they're incapable of doing it. You get the sense that it's just like no, we're going to do it to spite you. I'm going to be here and I'm going to be thirsty just because you want us to go, I'm going to not go, right? You get a lot of sense that they're just trying to throw, something into the gears to gum it up a little bit. Well, here's the thing. It costs about $10,000 a day if they're not to move it to. Every detachment costs about $10,000 a day. So if they're not moving, that's a lot of money. So they're at a standstill, and there's about 3 or 4 whites per every 2,000, per detachment, 4 or 5 whites per 2,000 people. What are the Army going to do? They have no power. They have zero power. The Creeks determined the manner in which they traveled during this period. The government lost. the Creeks got to go in the same direction as Apophyloholo said. All right? The route is the same, but again, I'll give you a couple of other examples of resistance. So for example, right here, we talked about the swamps. It's really inundated. In fact, one captain went through, it was up to a horse's back. The water was up to a horse's back. So they have 5 ferry boats that go down Montgomery's Point and up to Rock Row to bypass this. And it's mostly just to ferry them, not necessarily because you see they only use the steamboat right in this area. But the men want to walk. And so they literally walk through. And so the agents, like this Lieutenant Deese, tells them, okay, meet us in Little Rock on such and such a day. That day comes, they're not there. He actually has to ride back 60, 70 miles to figure out what they're doing. Now, some were down sick, but a lot of them were hunting. And they sent word back, they said, when we have enough bear skins, we'll come on. And he's like, and the guy in his journal says, what can I do, basically? He's just like, I can't. So he leaves them. He says, they'll catch up, they got money or whatever. He is powerless to do anything. And even as they go, this same agent, as they go west, they wake up, it's kind of rainy out. Creeks don't care about rain. They're going to march through rain if they want to go somewhere, but it's a little rainy out, so they're not going to march that day. And you can see how exasperated he is. The agent in charge of Detachment 1, he basically says something, this is paraphrasing, I'm in despair of getting to Arkansas. He says, I cannot get, nothing goes right. He talks about how nothing is going right on the journey. A West Point graduate, all right? Okay, well, I also mentioned it's ethnic cleansing because the federal government wants to round up any Creek Indian that has fled to other neighboring southeastern Indian groups. Many go up to the Cherokee Nation. A couple hundred go to the Chickasaw Nation. And then several hundred go down to the Seminole Nation. So agents go up. The same guy who basically rode back to check on the Creek Indians, he, a year later, is in charge of going into North Carolina to round up any Creeks up there. He only gets about 500 of them. They go to Ross's Landing, a.k.a. Chattanooga. They're put in a boat. They go the entire way. You see all the Ditto's Landing, Brown's Ferry, all that stuff, Decatur. Well, here's the thing with that. May of 1837, they're on flatboats. They're floating down the Tennessee River. Storms come. Wind comes. They have to dock the boats on the side of they beach them because they're afraid they're going to run into one of the islands or whatever here. 15 escape. They go in, 70 escape. They go in, more escape. They actually offer $1 for every Indian return, but 56 end up escaping when they get off the boat. They go the entire way right there. Around the same time in the fall of 1837, here's the Chickasaw. So they go up to Memphis. They're marching. They're marching about a mile behind 1,000 removed emigrating Chickasaws. So their camp is about a mile away. And then when the Chickasaws move, the Creeks move behind them. 7 steamboats are chartered at Memphis for the Chickasaws, and the Creeks share the steamboat Itasca with several hundred Chickasaws as well. They end up at Fort Gibson near the end of 1837. And then real quickly, so the federal government had the audacity, the gall, if you will, as the 5 detachments are marching out of East Alabama in August and September of 1836. Agents meet with the headmen to see if they'd be willing to offer up any warriors to help fight the Seminoles in Florida. The Second Seminole War began at the end of 1835 and was raging through 1836. The U.S. Army was failing to subdue the Seminoles, and so they thought, well, if the Creeks could help us stop the Seminole War, that would be great. 750 or so Creek Indians agreed to to fight in the Seminoles in Florida if they're allowed to end their tour of duty by February, so they would have time to plant crops by the spring in Oklahoma. and if their family members would be allowed to stay in East Alabama until they march together, until their tour of duty is over so they can all march together. So you have camps at Fort Mitchell. Echo Harjo's a chief. He's got a camp. Polecat Springs. Meanwhile, I mentioned that the Second Creek War ended in July of 1836. That's when the first detachment of prisoners went. Well, that's what the government thought. Turns out the Creeks got smart. 2,500 got captured. Those who didn't want to get captured fled to South Georgia, hid in the swamps. As soon as the army left because they thought the war was over, they decided to start attacking again. So in January of 1837, the Second Creek War resumes. Now, some of these Creek Indians are pretty smart. They see camps of these family members of the warriors fighting in Florida, and they go into camp and they receive free food. And then at night, they sneak out and they go kill a family, burn their plantation down, and then they show back up at the camp. Some did this, clearly, and some just hid in the swamps. Well, anyway, local militias descend on these camps, force them out. One 90-year-old man has his head bashed in with the butt of a musket. One 15-year-old Creek girl, there was an attempt of sexual assault on her. She escaped, but the guy shot her in the leg as she fled. The agent in charge of this, the agent in charge of these camps, by the way, is the same agent that conducted the 1834 voluntary immigrating party. He realized we got to get them out of here. So they moved them down to Mobile Point, aka Fort Morgan, where there are 4,000 Creek Indians, or 2,500 Creek Indians camped. A yellow fever sets in, and about 400 of them die. So this is a real bad place to camp them. So they moved them to Pass Christian, Mississippi, which, if you know anything about this is sort of the summer retreat for wealthy New Orleans people because it's got springs and it's airy. And anybody, when the sickly season of New Orleans hits, they go to Pass Christian. So they're there until October. So they broke two promises, right? They weren't allowed to remain in East Alabama, and they were supposed to be discharged in February. Now it's October, and they finally get discharged, and these soldiers, the Creek soldiers, leave Tampa Bay. They end up in New Orleans, where 9 steamboats are going to caravan up the Mississippi River. They leave in October. They go up right near Baton Rouge. There's an island in the middle of the river. Steamboats going up, go on one side. Steamboats descending the river, go on the other. The steamboat Monmouth went up the wrong side, and in the middle of the night was cut in half by a boat descending the river. The Creeks, who were great swimmers, by the way, unfortunately were trapped below deck. And when the steamboat sank, it basically split in part. They talk about the stern going one way and the bow going the other. They were trapped underneath the boat. And about 300 of them drowned. So this is the unfortunate, horrible, awful cherry on the top of the Creek removal era. But what I stress in Rivers of Sand is that although this is a story of tragedy, and by the way, we haven't even talked about the number of people that died in the first year of resettlement far outpaces the number of people who died on the route west. About 30%, 1/3 of all Indians who moved west, both during the voluntary period and the forced period, were dead within 1 calendar year in Indian Territory. So even though it's a horrible story of death and destruction and emotional turmoil because they're leaving the land of their ancestors, we do know that there are Creek Indians in Oklahoma today. We know that there are a porch band of Creek Indians in Alabama today. And so it's a story of survival as much as it's a story of death and destruction. And thank you so much for having me. And I'll take questions if you have any of them.